So the project is called Hard Drives from Space. It's a commission from Sonic Acts, and it kind of speculates on this idea of stones that fell from space in the northern western part of Greenland, and how a community there were kind of using this resource as part of their identity, but also part of like a way of making metal for tools. And the narrative kind of goes on into this colonial aspect of how during the North Pole expeditions, American and Danish colonizers would go and try and get to the North Pole, but to fund those trips they would also try and locate precious stones or mineral trophies, as we were kind of calling them, to sell to museums to finance these trips.
So maybe I explained the title, Hard Drives from Space. We were inspired by the capacity of iron meteorites to store magnetic information, to lock in magnetic data. So like hard drives, we can put something on them and then erase them, that info, and then we can rewrite that information as well. So that's what triggered us to speculate on what happens if we try to change the magnetic value of these stones again in a gesture to perhaps raise the colonial weight. The procedure is quite simple, actually. So what happens is the stones demagnetize when they are heated up above their Curie temperature. So that's when they lose their magnetic DNA, and when they're cooling down, they assimilate into new magnetic data sets. So what we do with the community in Greenland, we, with a simple blowtorch, we organized a community gathering, and everyone heated this piece of meteorite to above its Curie temperature, therefore erased the story of these stones being stolen, and also, as Louis mentioned, alongside people who have been relocated, put in a museum on display as a living anthropological zoo, as they called it back then. So there's a huge colonial hurt inscribed in that in the landscape of that northern part of Greenland.
The sound that you hear in the work is this kind of random expression of the landscape itself where the meteorite was taken from. So we recorded with artistic scientific instruments that we built the magnetic variation of the landscape. So also the landscape that is constantly breathing. It's, as we say, it's like a live geology. It's constantly in flux. And this flux for us was interesting to record as an inaudible phenomena, and then have that play into the space. So that's why the composition also of the piece is somehow always moving. It's kind of always dancing, it's never fixed. And I think that's very much also like how we research also, is not to make a definition, but to allow it to be plural. And that's why it's also fun to play with speculative stories, because there is no final answer. It continues to grow, it continues to change. This one is actually a tiny slice of the meteorite, and the meteorite by law belonged to the Danish crown. So it's very hard to kind of acquire a piece of it as property, because it's also seen as a high value object. So we purchased tiny slices of it, little fragments from the kind of eBay of the dark web through these kind of auction houses, and use these pieces to return them to Greenland. So there are many pieces that we kind of purchased and we took back to the community. And then, as Zuzanna said, we kind of did this decolonising ritual of heating it up and changing its history.
So this piece this has been taken in the late 19th century by Robert Perry. This was a huge piece. This is just a cut of from that piece. And he took this piece to fund his trip to the North Pole, because it hadn't been discovered by then yet by a white person. So he really wanted to fund his polar expedition to reach the North Pole and become famous and rich. So to fund that, he transported this piece of Arnakitsok, or Anigito as he called it, meteorite, and delivered it to Ethnographic Museum in New York, along with a group of indigenous people who were put behind a glass window and asked to reenact some sort of indigenous activities. And what happened, this piece has traveled back to Greenland a year ago with us, and his great-great-great-grandson, Alcatchak Perry, reheated this piece, so he erased the colonial history of that piece, and then, by cooling down, it assimilated into the new geomagnetic setup of the area of now.
Knowledge is passed on orally, it's spoken knowledge. Knowledge isn't written down, so history is also lost. When someone, like an elder or a shaman of a village dies, they die with a certain amount of knowledge that they didn't pass on through language, and spoken language most importantly. So the stories were kind of puzzled together through this idea of like semi-fictions also, or experiential ideas of maybe this, maybe that, maybe it could mean this. So when we returned the meteorite to the community, it suddenly became a medium for conversation. It wasn't just about the material value anymore, it was also about this idea of like, how can people speak through the stone? How can people create new narratives through the stone? And I think that's also just as important as the kind of scientific experiment, is also this idea of like implanting knowledge through a material and speaking through a material. And I think that was something like we couldn't have planned, we couldn't have like arranged, it just happened naturally, also because of how the culture like positions itself through creating knowledge. So this is the sound of the meteorite talking. I think also like a big part of it was this idea, which is very simple, but at the core of the kind of project is to listen, actually, and to use listening as a technique for slowing down. So with listening, especially like geological listening, the geology is always turned on in a way. It's constantly emitting signal, sound, masses of information are spreading around, it's all entangled, it's all noisy, and in this way, to listen to it, you have to kind of listen continuously, you have to be with it, you have to listen and slow down, and same with conversations with people, is it also takes this idea of like listening, but listening slowly. So I think that process of like, for us was, we're very much related to sound, art, and research, but also using this technique of listening was, when do you start listening? When do you stop listening? And I think through sound and listening before, because we've been building these kind of different types of microphones and different ways of listening and different methods, it made us slow down in a way. Like we would, set up these microphones and listen to the earth for like 7 hours, you know? Where the noise suddenly just becomes a continuous thing in your mind in a way. And I think that kind of practice helped with this project also. This idea of like, you can't just turn up, do the thing and leave, but you have to kind of tune in a way. And that tuning in takes time. And if you accelerate that, then you're just doing exactly what the kind of capitalism is doing to the nature itself. You just end up accelerating and destroying things. So I think taking this slowness also is like kind of a responsibility and a respect to the Earth's acceleration to kind of balance it in a way.
Thema